And the 2 words she said next changed everything. What could a toddler possibly know that an entire courtroom of lawyers had missed? And why did those 2 words make a hardened combat veteran freeze in his tracks before we reveal what happened? Next, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The London Family Division Courthouse on a Tuesday morning feels like watching paint dry in slow motion. Courtroom 4 was one of those beige windowless chambers where fluorescent lights buzz just loud enough to remind you they're there, and every footstep echoes off polished floors that have seen too many broken families. It was 10, and the custody hearing for Amelia Rose Fletcher was dragging into its 3rd day, the kind of civil case that doesn't make headlines. No dramatic outbursts, no shouting matches, just the grinding machinery of paperwork and procedure slowly deciding where a 3-year-old would spend the rest of her childhood. On the left side sat Anna Fletcher, 34, still wearing her wedding ring 2 years after the funeral. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of someone who'd been fighting this battle for months. Every time she shuffled through her notes, her hands trembled just slightly, the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you're drowning, but trying to look composed while it happens. Across the aisle, Oliver Trent looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread for successful businessmen. Sharp navy suit, perfectly knotted tie, the kind of confident smile that never quite reached his eyes. His solicitor did most of the talking while Trent just nodded at appropriate moments, like a man who'd rehearsed this performance. Tucked away in the back corner, almost invisible to anyone not trained to notice such things, sat someone who didn't belong in the civilian world. Lance Sergeant Kieran Holt, Coldstream Guards, 41 years old, with the kind of shoulders that came from 18 years of carrying more than just a rifle. He wore a charcoal gray coat over civilian clothes, but his posture gave him a way back straight without being stiff, hands relaxed but ready, eyes that swept the room in systematic patterns every 30 seconds. Off duty, out of uniform, technically had no business being there at all, but the little girl at the center of this legal nightmare was his goddaughter, and that trumped every regulation in the book. Holt had learned patience in places where impatience got people killed. 2 tours in Helmand Province had taught him the difference between looking and seeing, between hearing words and understanding what they really meant. Now he applied those same skills to reading the temperature of a courtroom where something felt fundamentally wrong. He wasn't there to speak, wasn't there to interfere. On paper, he had no standing whatsoever, but Harry Fletcher had made him a promise on a dusty airstrip in Kandahar Province 5 years ago, and Kieran Holt didn't break promises to dead friends. They'd been waiting for a supply helicopter that was running 3 hours late, sharing lukewarm coffee from a thermos that tasted like diesel fuel and regret. Harry had pulled out a crumpled photo of baby Amelia, barely 6 months old, all chubby cheeks and curious eyes. "Look at her, Kieran," Harry had said, voice soft with the kind of love that makes soldiers vulnerable. "She's going to grow up thinking her dad's some kind of hero. Truth is, I'm just trying not to get myself killed before I can teach her to ride a bike." That's when Harry had made him swear it, not with dramatic ceremony, but with the quiet certainty of a man who'd seen too many good soldiers not make it home. "If something happens to me, you watch over them. Anna's strong, but she'll need someone who understands what we do out here. And Amelia, she'll need someone who knew her father was more than just a name on a memorial wall." Holt had shaken his hand, thinking it was one of those promises you make hoping you'll never have to keep. Now, sitting in a courtroom where lawyers were treating Harry's daughter like a legal commodity, he understood that some promises become more important after they're broken by circumstances beyond anyone's control, especially when their daughters needed someone to stand guard. The hearing had all the warmth of a tax audit. Documents shuffled, witnesses testified, character references were read aloud in the flat institutional tone that makes human emotion sound like evidence. Trent's team operated like a machine, every motion filed on time, every piece of evidence presented with clinical precision. They painted Nena as unstable, overwhelmed, financially insecure, a grieving widow who couldn't provide the structure a child needed. Her defense felt like watching someone try to bail out a sinking boat with a teacup. Her solicitor was competent but overworked, and Nena herself kept losing her train of thought mid-sentence, not because she was confused, but because she was exhausted from months of being told she wasn't good enough to raise her own daughter. But none of that bothered Holt as much as the child. Amelia sat beside a court-appointed guardian, dressed in a navy coat that looked expensive but somehow wrong on her small frame. Her black shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Her hair was pulled back with mathematical precision, not a strand out of place. She looked perfect. Too perfect. In 18 years of military service, Holt had learned to spot the difference between discipline and fear. He'd seen it in villages where children had been taught that silence meant survival, where being noticed meant danger. Amelia wasn't just quiet, she was performing quiet, hands folded exactly in her lap, back unnaturally straight for a 3-year-old, eyes fixed on a spot somewhere near her feet. When adults spoke to her, she didn't look up. When other children passed in the corridor, she didn't show interest. She sat like a soldier at inspection, and that scared the hell out of him. Every few minutes Holt's gaze would drift back to her, and his unease would tighten another notch. Children that age don't act like that without reason. They fidget, they ask questions, they get bored and slouch and need to be reminded to sit up straight. They don't hold themselves like tiny prisoners. From his position in the back row, Holt could see what the court couldn't: the way Amelia's shoulders went rigid whenever Trent's voice carried across the room, how she gripped something hidden under her arm whenever the lawyers got louder, the slight flinch when anyone moved too quickly in her peripheral vision. These weren't signs of shyness, they were trauma responses. And everyone else in the room was too busy looking at paperwork to notice. Oliver Trent took the stand like he'd been born for it. Confident stride, firm handshake with his own solicitor, the kind of performance that made observers want to trust him before he'd said a word. "Your Honor," he began, voice warm but authoritative, "I want what's best for Amelia. I've always wanted that." He cited his stable income, his quiet home in Surrey, his clean background check, spoke about child development theory like he'd memorized a textbook, mentioned educational opportunities, structured routines, emotional stability, all the right words in all the right order. "Amelia needs consistency," he continued, glancing sympathetically toward Nena, "not chaos. She's been through enough disruption." The knife dressed as concern. Holt watched Nena shrink a little further into her chair while Trent painted her grief as instability, her financial struggles as negligence, her fierce love for her daughter as somehow inadequate. But Holt was also watching Amelia. The child hadn't moved since Trent started speaking, not even the small fidgets that children usually make. She'd gone completely still, like prey freezing when a predator walks by. That stillness spoke louder than any testimony. Then Holt noticed what she was holding. Tucked against her side, mostly hidden by her coat, was a small gray elephant faded fabric, one ear slightly bent, the carefully sewn patch along its belly, where the stuffing had once leaked out. Holt's breath caught. He knew that elephant. 5 years ago, Harry Fletcher had pressed that exact toy into Holt's hands during a supply run in Kandahar. "She won't sleep without it," Harry had laughed. "Survived 3 deployments and more teething sessions than I can count. If anything happens to me, you make sure she gets this back. She'll know who it's from." After Harry's funeral, Nena had asked about it. The elephant had gone missing during the chaos of legal arrangements and moving boxes. They'd searched everywhere, under beds, in storage units, through every bag and box from the military housing. Gone. Until now. Holt leaned forward slightly, studying the toy with the focused attention of someone who'd once diffused improvised explosives. Same gray fabric, same bent ear, same threadbare patch in exactly the same spot. But Nena hadn't found it, which meant someone else had. Someone with access to Harry's personal effects. Someone who'd held onto it for 2 years before producing it now at exactly the right moment to establish familiarity with a frightened child. The elephant wasn't a comfort item anymore. It was a prop, and that realization made everything else click into place. The perfect clothes, the unnatural stillness, the way Amelia responded to Trent's voice like she'd been trained. This wasn't a custody dispute. This was psychological conditioning, dressed up as legal proceedings. The morning stretched on with the relentless pace of bureaucracy grinding through human lives. More documents were submitted. More character witnesses testified via video link. More evidence was entered into the record with the mechanical precision of an assembly line. Trent's solicitor produced photographs: Amelia at a petting zoo, Amelia holding a balloon at what looked like a fair, Amelia sitting on a park bench eating ice cream. All the images of a normal, happy relationship between a caring guardian and a well-adjusted child. But Holt noticed what the court missed. In every single photograph, Amelia's smile looked painted on, not the natural, gap-toothed grin of a 3-year-old discovering the world, but the careful expression of someone who'd learned that the camera required a specific response. Her hands were always clenched, Her posture always perfect. Her eyes never quite reached the camera, as if she was looking at something just off frame, something that worried her. These weren't family photos. They were documentation, the kind of careful record-keeping that people do when they're building a story, rather than living one. Elelonana's turn came just after lunch, and she approached the witness stand like someone walking to their own execution. Her voice shook when she was sworn in. Her hands trembled as she tried to organize her notes. "I held my daughter the night her father didn't come home," she said quietly. "I held her through the nightmares, the questions about why Daddy wasn't at breakfast anymore, the days when she'd wait by the window for a car that wasn't coming." Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. "I've been her mother for 3 years, not part-time, not on weekends, every sleepless night, every fever, every scraped knee. And now I'm being told that's not enough because I cry sometimes, and our savings account isn't big enough." Trent's solicitor objected to the emotional nature of the testimony. The judge sustained it gently, but firmly. Elelonana tried to explain about the elephant, about how Amelia had never been that quiet before, about instincts that couldn't be documented or filed with the court. But every word came out sounding desperate rather than credible. Meanwhile, Amelia sat like a statue, not fidgeting, not asking for water or needing the bathroom, not doing any of the 100 small things that children do during long, boring adult conversations, just sitting, holding that elephant, staring at nothing. And everyone in the courtroom saw a well-behaved child instead of a frightened one. Everyone except Kieran Holt. By mid-afternoon, the weight of the day was visible on every face in the courtroom. The judge's initial patience had worn thin. Elelonana looked defeated. Even Trent's confidence had settled into the comfortable smugness of someone watching their plan unfold exactly as expected. The judge closed her notebook with a soft thud that echoed like a gavel in the quiet room. "We'll take a brief recess," she announced. 15 minutes. "I'll return with preliminary thoughts before we determine next steps." Chairs scraped against linoleum. Lawyers leaned toward clients with whispered consultations. The court clerk gathered papers with the efficient movements of someone who'd seen this routine 1,000 times. Kieran Holt rose from his seat in the back row, not quickly, not dramatically, just the quiet movement of a man who'd been sitting still for too long. He gathered his coat across one arm, keeping his movements small and respectful. He wasn't supposed to be noticed, wasn't supposed to matter. But as he stepped into the aisle, a sound cut through the rustle of papers and quiet conversations. A child's voice, barely a whispered, "Safe man." Holt froze. The words were so quiet that most people didn't register them immediately. A few conversations continued. Someone coughed. "Papers." Then the guardian beside Amelia leaned forward sharply. "Did you say something, love?" The judge, halfway standing, paused. "What did she say?" Amelia was pointing, small arm outstretched, tiny finger aimed directly at the back of the courtroom. "At him." "Safe man," she said again, louder this time, clear enough that everyone heard it. The room went completely silent. Elelonana dropped her pen. Trent's solicitor turned in his chair. Even the court stenographer looked up from her machine. And Holt stood there, coat over his arm, feeling like someone had just fired a flare in a dark room. For the first time all day, Amelia looked up from her fixed stare at the floor. Her eyes found his across the courtroom, small, uncertain, but absolutely clear. "Safe man." The phrase hit him like a physical blow, not because he'd taught it to her, not because they'd practiced it, but because it was something Harry used to say back in Kandahar, during the long nights when patrols went wrong and good soldiers didn't make it back to base. Harry would joke about the guys who always seemed to bring everyone home. "You're the safe man," he'd tell Holt, "the one who sees the tripwire before anyone steps on it." And then during one of their last conversations over a crackling satellite phone, Harry had told Elelonana about it. "If anything ever happens to me," Holt remembered him saying, "you tell Amelia this. Kieran Holt is the safe man. You find him, and he'll know what to do." It was a promise between soldiers, a father's last attempt to give his daughter someone who would see her the way he saw her. And now, 3 years later, in a courtroom full of legal arguments and documentation, Amelia had remembered not the name, not the details, just the feeling. The judge straightened in her chair. "Sergeant Holt, please return to your seat." He did, moving with the same quiet precision he'd shown all day, but now every eye in the courtroom was on him. "Has the child spoken to you before today?" the judge asked carefully. "No, ma'am." His voice was steady, professional. "Did anyone coach her to say that?" "No, ma'am." "And yet she identified you, specifically." Holt considered his words carefully. I wasn't expecting it, but I'm not entirely surprised. The judge turned back to Amelia, her voice gentle. Sweetheart, why did you call him that? Amelia looked up again, still pointing. She didn't answer immediately. Then, in the same whisper that had started, everything, she said. Daddy told me. The silence that followed was deafening. Oliver Trent shifted in his chair, his composure finally cracking. This is ridiculous, he muttered loudly. Enough for several people to hear. She's 3 years old. Children make things up. Someone's been coaching her. But the judge wasn't looking at Trent anymore. She was studying Amelia with the careful attention of someone who'd suddenly realized they might have been missing something important. Did your father tell you about Mr. Holt? She asked gently. Amelia nodded, still clutching the gray elephant. When did he tell you this? In my dreams, she whispered, and when mommy cries. Anna burst into tears. The judge looked from the sobbing mother to the silent soldier to the little girl, who'd just spoken her first words in 3 days of legal proceedings. We're not resuming in 15 minutes, she announced. This court will reconvene in 1 hour. Mr. Holt, please don't leave the building. Holt nodded once. Trent stood abruptly. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. Sit down, Mr. Trent, the judge said, her voice carrying a new edge. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because the smallest person in the courtroom had just said something that changed everything. When the court reconvened an hour later, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The earlier sense of routine procedure had been replaced by something sharper, more focused. The judge entered with the bearing of someone who'd spent the recess making phone calls and checking precedents. Before we proceed to any rulings, Judge Marmon began. This court will hear testimony from Sergeant Kieran Holt. Holt walked to the witness stand with the same measured pace he'd used all day. He was sworn in quickly, his voice steady and clear when he stated his name and rank. Sergeant Holt. The judge began. What is your relationship to the child? I served with her father, Staff Sergeant Harry Fletcher, Coldstream Guards 2. Deployments. He named me her godfather when she was born. Were you aware of this custody dispute before today? No, ma'am. I knew Anna was struggling with legal challenges, but I didn't know the specifics until recently. What brought you to court today? Holt's answer was characteristically direct. Someone had to be here for Amelia. Her father asked me to look after his girls if anything happened to him. I consider that a standing order. The judge leaned forward slightly. Tell me what you observed during today's proceedings. Holt didn't embellish. He described Amelia's unnatural stillness, her lack of normal childhood responses, the way she seemed to shrink whenever Trent spoke. He mentioned her perfect posture, her careful silence, the trained quality of her behavior. What military experience have you seen similar behavior patterns? Yes, ma'am. In children who've been conditioned to fear the consequences of being noticed. Trent's solicitor started to object, but the judge waved him off. Tell me about the elephant, she said. I gave that toy to Harry Fletcher before his final deployment. It disappeared after his funeral. Mrs. Fletcher searched for it extensively. The fact that Amelia has it now means someone with access to the family's personal effects kept it. Could it not have been returned by the mother? No, ma'am. She's been asking about it for 2 years. The judge made a note. What significance do you attach to its reappearance? Holt chose his words carefully. Familiar objects can be used to create false comfort to make a child compliant by giving them something that feels safe, even when the situation isn't. And the phrase safe man, Harry used that term about soldiers who brought everyone home alive. Before his last deployment, he told Anna that if anything happened to him, she should tell Amelia I was the safe man, that she could find me if she needed help. Did you ever use that phrase directly with the child? No, ma'am. She was barely walking when her father died. The judge sat back slightly. So you're suggesting she retained this information from when she was an infant? I'm suggesting that children remember more than we think, especially when they're frightened. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes, but the damage was already done. Holt's testimony had introduced reasonable doubt, where there had been none. His military bearing and careful, factual responses lent credibility to observations that might have seemed far-fetched, coming from anyone else. When he stepped down, the judge immediately called for a recess. But this time, she also ordered an immediate forensic review of all submitted documentation. 3 days later, the courtroom reconvened for what everyone expected to be final arguments. Instead, they got something else entirely. Judge Marmon entered with a folder thick enough to choke a horse and an expression that could have frozen water. The court-ordered verification process has revealed significant irregularities in the documentation submitted by Mr. Trent's legal team. She began. The words landed like artillery shells. The birth certificate submitted as evidence has been determined to be a digitally altered forgery. The medical records contain signatures from physicians who have no record of treating the child in question. Financial documentation has been backdated and modified. Trent sat perfectly still, but Holt could see sweat beading on his forehead. Most significantly, the judge continued. Genetic testing has confirmed that Mr. Trent has no biological relationship to Amelia Fletcher whatsoever. Elalonena gasped. Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Furthermore, investigation has revealed that Mr. Trent gained access to the Fletcher family's personal effects through a business relationship with Mrs. Fletcher's estranged brother-in-law, who had been storing items from the military housing clearance. The complete picture was becoming clear: not a custody dispute, but an elaborate fraud. A man with no connection to the family, who had somehow identified a vulnerable widow and child, then spent months building false documentation and conditioning a traumatized toddler to accept his presence. Mr. Trent, the judge said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, you are hereby held in contempt of court. These proceedings are being referred to the Crown Prosecution Service for criminal investigation. Court officers moved toward Trent's table. He didn't resist, but his mask finally slipped completely. You have no idea what you've done, he said, his voice tight with rage. No idea what you've cost me. Not cost us, cost me. Because this had never been about Amelia's welfare. It had been about something else entirely, something that would take investigators months to fully unravel. Elalonena was awarded immediate custody, of course, but by then, the legal victory felt secondary to something more important. Amelia had spoken. More than that, she had remembered something her father told her when she was too young to understand it, and she had trusted that memory enough to act on it. In a room full of adults arguing about her future, she had identified the one person who saw her the way her father had wanted her to be seen, as someone worth protecting. The weeks that followed were quiet ones. No media coverage, no dramatic interviews, just the slow work of healing that happens when the immediate crisis is over and normal life tries to reassert itself. Elalonena and Amelia moved back into their small house in Putney, with its narrow garden and the rose bushes that Harry had planted during his last leave. Elalonena returned to work part-time. Amelia started preschool. And sometimes, on weekends, a tall man in civilian clothes would stop by to check the locks, fix a leaky tap, or simply sit in the garden while a little girl played with toy soldiers in the grass. Kieran Holt never talked about what had happened in court, didn't give interviews, didn't accept thanks. He showed up when needed, stayed as long as necessary, and left when things were stable. The promise he'd made to Harry Fletcher wasn't the kind that came with an expiration date. One Saturday afternoon, as autumn was settling over London and the leaves in Elalonena's garden were turning gold, Amelia approached Holt with something in her small hands, the gray elephant. She didn't say anything, just walked up to where he was sitting, placed the toy carefully on the bench beside him, and then hugged his leg once, briefly, naturally, without fear. Then she ran back toward the house, where her mother was making tea and humming something that sounded almost like happiness. Holt picked up the elephant, feeling its worn fabric and noting how the bent ear had been carefully straightened. Someone had taken time to repair it properly, to restore it to something closer to what it had been, before it became a tool for manipulation. He set it back down and watched Amelia chase falling leaves across the small lawn. No one filmed it. No one wrote about it. No newspaper would run the story of a royal guard who spent his leave day fixing a garden gate and ensuring that a dead soldier's daughter knew she was safe. But it was the only victory that mattered to him, because sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons or rhetoric or legal briefs. Sometimes they're fought with attention, with presence, with the simple act of being there when someone needs to know they're not alone. Staff Sergeant Harry Fletcher had asked his best friend to be the safe man for his daughter, and Kieran Holt had kept that promise, not with drama or heroics, but with the quiet consistency that defines real courage, by showing up, by paying attention, by trusting that sometimes the smallest voices in the room are the ones telling the most important truths. Have you ever had a gut feeling that something was wrong, even when everything looked normal on the surface? Do you think children really Remember things from when they're too young to understand them? What would you have done if a 3-year-old pointed at you and called you the safe man in front of a courtroom full of strangers? If this story changed how you think about the quiet heroes who serve in our military, the ones who keep their promises long after the uniforms come off, show your respect by hitting that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about the real people behind the ceremony, and make sure to ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most important protection doesn't come from weapons or walls, but from people who remember what they promised and keep their word, no matter what it costs them. Check out our other Royal Guard stories appearing on your screen now. Each one reveals a different side of the men and women who balance tradition with humanity every single day. We'll see you tomorrow with another story that proves these guards are so much more than ceremonial statues. They're protectors, promise keepers, and sometimes the only thing standing between innocence and those who would exploit it. Until then, remember, the safe man isn't always the one with the biggest weapon. Sometimes it's just the one who shows up when everyone else looks away.